Thank you very much. We decided here on the panel that we are not a group of experts, we're a group of fellow learners that are trying to very hard to move us forward. So I want to stress that this session is really about that. It's about beginning to move forward. We heard this morning about the numbers and the challenges. We heard about the interest from key donor agencies on what to do and how to do it. We heard about the international commitments that all the governments of the world, or most of the governments of the world, have signed up for. We heard from Professor Durkin on the key questions to be answered. We heard one powerful story from one beneficiary of the programs that we are all supposed to be working on. We heard about specific country examples in the plenary, and I know in the parallel sessions now. We heard about research findings. So now this panel of learners will try to begin to move us to looking forward. Let's not keep looking back, but look forward. And just to warn the panel, the two questions I would like you to answer is, what do we need to do differently? Do more of, do less of? And how do we need to work differently? Because I've heard both things, and I think, at least for a development practitioner like myself, those are essential questions. It's not only what we do, but how we do it. So if the panel will begin to think about that, and we have a brilliant panel of experts or learners, you can pick your own title. Natalia Winter-Rossi, who is Social Protection Team Lead and Deputy Director in the Food and Agriculture Organization. Carol Laurent, who is Deputy Director of the Center for Resilience at USAID. Dr. Fabio Veras, Senior Researcher at International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth. And Camilla Knox-Peoples, Deputy Humanitarian Director at Oxfam. So we have donors, agencies, researchers, and international civil society here. Perfect. So before, though, to make sure that we all have the same data, I am an economist of the ilk, have data will regress. So we will want to look at first hear from each of the three parallel sessions. Now, this is going to be a real challenge for these people because they were very rich sessions. And the job of the moderator is to report back in 2 minutes what was said in an hour and a half of very intense discussions. So I will first call on the chair for the first of the parallel session, Dominique Burgeon. So I'll start the 2 minutes now, and when this starts beeping, your time is up. Go.
Oh my God, thank you. So, very rich discussion, very long. I'll not try to summarize, but clearly a recognition that social production is a key element to address the root cause of vulnerability. Recognition also highlight that the strong political will is essential, and to ensure development partners, coordination, alignment, and harmonization. The recognition of importance to build the national social protection system building basically on existing systems. In the case of Somalia, there is very strong systems that are already in place. We need to build on that. Also, that the fact that there are different needs according to different populations, and the fact that basically cash is not enough. We need to add other dimensions to that. We should not expect cash transfer to solve everything. And then finally, in the case of the Somalia session, I mean, there was a sense that we missed the opportunity in 2011. No, all the elements are in place. We should not miss the opportunity. We have the political will is there, the donor commitment is there, and we should build on the existing capacities that have been put at full scale during the current humanitarian response. Thank you.
So, Eppu on civilian crisis management and systemic social protection development in context of protracted crises.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I'm going to talk about three main areas that we had in a very diverse conversation. But the starting point was this. Whereas we are now having the conversation mainly on the kind of what we call continuum or nexus between the humanitarian and development, there are also other sectors that are really important and perhaps are not getting much attention at the moment, including the security sector and also all the work done with peace building. So we were looking at what the outcomes of social protection can be in this context, and there was a strong message saying that nation building and building of social contract are outcomes of social protection that are very relevant to the security sector. We were looking at the fact that a conversation from Uganda this morning, and also in our session that came up often, was security. So in order to have access to social protection, to deliver it, you have to have security. Looking at police, in very practically, Afghanistan, you have 4,000 police killed every year. If you don't have protection for yourself, insurance, or your family, how much are you going to go and do in terms of produce security and secure security for the whole country? So if police is not trusted, the government is not trusted, which is just coming back to this whole circle around nation building and social protection potentially being much more than we perhaps are looking at the moment. We recognize that the security sector is a difficult one, and we tolerate it at the moment. It's a clean slate, and the message was that this is an opportunity that we could do, and it will clearly require a huge amount of joint effort, which is why we are here. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are doing the impossible here. Dr. John Westwood, for the third session.
Okay, so this session 1C was on thinking longer term in fragile contexts, and we discussed the role of social protection transitioning from fragility to stability, noted that there's a theoretical case, but there's limited evidence. We heard from Pakistan on a case of building up health insurance in a context of multiple sources of fragility. And some of the conclusions are that we don't need to overburden social protection in these contexts. We don't need to try to fit everything in, not be too complicated in the programs, but that at the same time it's important to recognize how we do social protection is critical. Bad programs can undermine trust, bad targeting leads to exclusion. And then we also talked about how to build up evidence and to replicate learning. And we recognized that each context is different, but what's the most critical thing is to build up a number of sources of evidence, case studies, just collect the information and put it together, and that the time to invest in this is now. So the conclusion is really that, yes, we really need to do social protection in fragile settings, adjust it to the fragile settings, don't overburden it with other things, and then make sure that we measure what is happening.
Thank you very much. These three people just proved me wrong. I said there's no way that three experts can say everything that was summarized in 2 minutes each, so thank you very much, guys. That was really amazing. That's all the sessions there was, right? There was only those three. So now we all have the same data. We all know a taste of what went on in those sessions. So let me turn to the panel and ask you those two questions. What is it that you think we should be thinking about in terms of doing more of, doing less of, and how do we do it? I think we heard from all three panels hints at some of those answers. So now let me turn to you. Do you want to start?
You're going to time me also?
I'll time you if you run too long.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss some of the things that we're learning, because I think it's important that we all recognize that this is not necessarily a new area, but definitely an area with new challenges and where we have to put our heads together in this particular types of settings. I think that maybe what I'm going to say is a bit paradoxical, but I think we need to be ambitious in terms of our vision, as well as very realistic in terms of what we can achieve in short, medium, and long term. I think building risk-informed social protection systems, and you add that in context of fragility and forced displacement, requires two things. One, a lot of innovation, and innovation that can be tested, evaluated, and proved that then can be scaled up, as well as, you know, the flexibility to have a lot of reality checks around the way. No? We have to, I think we can learn from successful experiences, in maybe not in contexts that are exactly the same, but learning from the HSNP in Kenya, or what Lesotho did, or what the Philippines did, even though may not be exactly the same and relevant for Somalia, definitely has a lot of elements that could be, you know, learned and extrapolated to build a longer case. Taking advantage of a lot of the work that already humanitarian actors throughout, you know, the spectrum are doing in trying to also find innovation, working in very complex contexts. No? So how will we use that investment to be able to build something that is not perfect, not necessarily, you know, the perfect model that we want to see from a development perspective, but at least some sort of a system that could progressively be more effective, more cost efficient, and more impactful. I think something that we spoke a little bit in the Somalia session, but not necessarily throughout the conference, which is learning from also the community-based responses and the community structures that are already in place, that have been working also for a long time in the absence of strong national systems, and how to integrate those into clear responses, particularly when we're talked about extreme fragility. And I think being very innovative in how can we combine different sources of funding to be able to design all the components of risk-informed and shock responsive. Can we think about development actors putting the resources in making sure that programs are at scale, while humanitarian funding focusing on those particular elements that make the system more shock responsive. So in the morning, Dr. Durkan talked about, you know, predictable financing. Can we think about, you know, particular funding mechanisms that could particularly look at the contingency funds that are needed to be in place to ensure that you have a response, while we continue working to enhance the capacity of governments to really expand social protection systems per se. So have a combination of funding that also can look at the different pieces of the puzzle. And as I think has been said in many of the sessions, that we always talk about cash, because cash definitely has been the instrument of choice for obvious reasons in many of the responses, but is one within a much more broader set of instruments. And how can we complement those interventions with other key ones in terms of nutrition, in terms of productive interventions and others? So we're talking about resilience in a much more comprehensive way, looking at social as well as economic dimensions. And when I talk about flexibility and reality check, is what exactly can we achieve, and in what time frame? No, what we can do in 6 months, in a year, in 2 months? What are the different evaluation or assessment processes that we have to put into place to be able to progressively move towards the systems? Can we have a menu of responses based on the context, but most importantly, based on the specific vulnerabilities of those that we're trying to reach, in terms of income, in terms of vulnerability, in terms of access to markets, in other ways? I think that there's been, from my perspective, a recognition in many of the resilience programs or humanitarian programs that we cannot look at from one angle, you know, from either a food security angle or a livelihood angle or a basic services angle. But we need to find a way of building resilience and taking into account the different components. How then we can translate that when we're also defining a national social protection program, which, from those like me that have been working in this area for some time, it's always been seen only as a social type intervention, and where in reality is also contributing to, you know, a broader, if you want, socioeconomic type transformation. So how can we translate that resilience perspective also when we're thinking about national systems, which I think will be key. I don't remember who said it. I don't know if it was probably also Dr. Durkan, to talk about let's give people cash, but also hope. The definition of what hope will mean, I think it will depend on, are we talking about opportunities to move from subsistence to productivity? Is it moving from just accessing basic services to be able to, in the long term, be able to take care of my children and family? So I think in this context is where it becomes a bit more complicated in defining the plus, you know, the complementary systems. And it's the concept of systems that is what I think bring us today. So I don't know if I necessarily answered the question, but for me it's about being ambitious in the long term, while being very realistic that this is still, unfortunately, but maybe also importantly, a process, not a learning path around it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I think you answered the questions very well. Carol, how about you?
Yes. Hello, I'm very happy to be here and enjoying the sessions so far very much. As you had mentioned, it's been a very rich discussion, and I think very difficult to capture everything that we've heard this morning in this session, but hopefully it also provides opportunities to continue talking to everyone as well. So I think I was asked to speak from a donor perspective, which is probably not very easy to do, and I will try to do my best. I've kind of tried to think of it from some of the challenges that we face from the donors' side. So I think one that many may be familiar with if you've worked with USAID or with some other donors, you may have grappled with the issues of that were raised this morning of really humanitarian versus development, and at least from USAID, coming from the perspective of defining different funding spigots, this really will continue to be a challenge. I don't think it's something that we will get away from anytime soon. Of course, there are ways of adjusting, making adjustments that you mentioned, looking at cross-cutting programming, but the work that we're doing oftentimes or the work that you're doing, implementing partners are doing, oftentimes do have to be sort of looked at from whether or not they're receiving development resources or emergency resources. So this will continue to be a challenge that we face. There's also, in addition to this, a little bit of a challenge with regards to short-term and long-term. Programmatically speaking, I think many of our programs that we're talking about today and tomorrow maybe start out being more shorter-term response programs, and then maybe become more protracted programs. And this also it can be somewhat difficult as it tends to separate whether or not you're receiving emergency or development resources. Another challenge is also who are our partners, who are our implementing partners. Looking at it, if we're working with governments, versus international partners versus NGOs, who is actually doing the implementation of the program, often sort of tend to the response from the donor's perspective gets adjusted, and funding may differ, award modalities may differ, and these seem like very sort of process-oriented issues, but at the end of the day, they really do tend to sort of frame the approaches that are taken or the funding that is provided. And this gets at the importance of relationships. I think beyond who's doing the implementation, what is ultimately achieved both long-term and short-term can also be looked at from the perspective of what the implementing partner's relationship is with the entity, whether it's the government, whether it's a national government, whether it's another NGO, or how this enters into the design of a program can be very pertinent. But there are, of course, ways to alleviate these potential challenges. One, as was mentioned by several this morning and this afternoon, is really using learning and using knowledge and evidence base that exists to inform program design. And most importantly, getting back at the relationships is also like who is doing the learning. Oftentimes we have access to learning opportunities, or we have access to case studies and evidence, but oftentimes it may or may not reach the population that we're working with. It may or may not reach the beneficiaries or local governments, so that everybody is learning and everybody is on the same page, or at least everybody has the opportunity to discuss. I think from our perspective, we are finding that this is more and more critical and important to informing program design. So continuing to incorporate learning to add to sort of common improved knowledge is critical. We also see that need to increased focus learning on where there is no state. If we are working in a fragile environment where there is no state, I think it becomes very relevant to have a better understanding of how well has this worked, where is it working well. Oftentimes PSNP in Ethiopia and the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya are cited as examples of really very good safety net or social protection systems that work well with a surge component. But of course, these are programs where there is a state, and it's very clear. So having the opportunity to really learn from other options would be very important. I don't want to lose sight of time, but I think also using the context, really informing ourselves based on context design is going to become increasingly very, very important. In this particular aspect, I think knowing the population that you're working with and looking at it from a standpoint of how the population is reacting to the shock that they're in, rather than the shock itself. So if that's having a good understanding of what are the coping mechanisms that populations utilize, and being able to adjust our programming to intercede before those coping measures become very negative, is regardless of the tool that we're utilizing, really focusing on the coping mechanisms and the coping strategies, I think could also be a way to alleviate some of the challenges that we face. Just to end, I would say that what would be helpful would be to really tie in, and we've seen this, the use of shock responsive planning. So I think from our experience, we've seen that it's been much more helpful to move from a stable system to an unstable system, because that basis or that foundation may already exist. So when you're moving to a more fragile or unstable system, we can do that based on the foundation that already exists. The question I would throw back maybe at folks, I didn't hear it being raised too much today, and I think there still is a lot out there that we need to talk about more, is the impact or the use of insurance systems in social protection or safety net programs, and just how far we can sort of use or utilize an insurance mechanism to alleviate some of these stresses or these shocks. I think about the Caribbean with the recent occurrence of hurricanes, if it were one hurricane, maybe insurance system, the Caribbean insurance system would be right there and able to provide assistance. I think this is really very trying for the system, having so many islands affected by this hurricane season. So up to what point can you use insurance, and how does that enter into our planning? So in there.
Thank you very much. I forgot to say that there are pieces of paper on your tables in case you have questions or comments from the panel. We, again, in the interest of trying to make things efficient, there are volunteers who will collect them, and I will do my brutal managing of them if there are too many. Thank you very much, Carol. Now, Fabio, from more of a research perspective, you're a professional learner. What's your advice for us?
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this panel. Thank you also for this learning opportunity and for the opportunity to reflect a little bit on not only on the research work that we do collectively at the IPC, and also with our development partners that also help us in this work and working with the countries, but also in the experience of working together with government officials and people in the field. Just to make it clear, I come from the social protection side, so I'm not coming from the humanitarian response or the humanitarian side. So I want to make it clear, this bias, and of course it's going to influence some of the things I'm gonna say, and also it explains a little bit the selection case studies or the selective experience that I would like to comment on. The second aspect I would like to highlight, for me, the novelty on the conference on the topic was that it went a little bit more narrow in terms of the focusing on the response to conflict and fragile contexts, more than just on the more general shock responsive that were more used to discuss, and where I think there is more evidence and expertise to try to draw some lessons and to have a clear idea of the challenges ahead. Having said that, from our own experience, the social protection context that I'm more familiar with, that we have worked, but on the social protection side, was actually a country that unfortunately is still in the middle of a war. It's the case of Yemen. And working with Yemen for us was particularly interesting because it is actually a unique case, I would say, of a low-income country that had a large social safety net or a large social protection program. So UNICEF Yemen had contacted IPC not only to evaluate, but actually to try to update the household survey data at the country level in several dimensions. So it was a little bit of a mix of a household survey with a mix with a DHS, but also looking at the social protection mechanisms, and particularly at the social welfare fund, which was this large unconditional cash transfer program, quite in line with the social assistance in the region that focus more on categories rather than on the simply poverty targeting. There has been some change back with the support of the bank, but the idea of that you have the vulnerable categories that need protection is pretty much one of the characteristics of the whole Middle Eastern and North Africa country. So one of the things that actually draw our attention when presenting some of the results in Sana'a, in the capital, was that most people were very pessimistic, and I would say they didn't believe that the program actually worked. So we are not only talking about with the ministry that was implemented, there was the Ministry of Finance and several other ministries there, but people had this belief that actually on the fields, this money wouldn't get to the poor, that the system was corrupted, and that the social workers wouldn't do their work. That was the belief, and they struggled to understand and actually to believe on the evidence that we were showing. And the evidence was quite robust because it was a household survey. So people actually were saying that to enumerators, independent enumerators that had been hired. And actually, we decided to go further and we cross this data with the administrative data from the program. So actually what people were saying they were receiving, the people that were identified in this completely independent household survey, because people were listed by enumeration areas and all this. We didn't have previously the list of those who were beneficiaries of the programs. They were there. They also were in the registry of the Ministry of Social Affairs. So, and people simply didn't believe they get this money. So we double check how much they would get, how much was in the figures that they were paid, and actually they were paid. So that came as a big surprise. So one of the first things that I think that taught me was actually not to believe so much what we hear in the capital when we go into the mission. Everybody says that, oh, look, the social workers, they don't work, people don't get this money, they got stolen in the post office or in delivery mechanism or whatever they use. So it's very easy to believe that, because basically they are the elites in these countries, and elites everywhere in my country, they don't believe that the poor are receiving all this service. So one of the things, and I was reading some material from the World Bank and even from OPM recently, preparing for the conference, and they were saying that's one of the best practices, on the first thing that you need to do when there is an humanitarian response and you want to use the social protection mechanism that are in place, is both to look to the informal social protection that there is in place. Natalia mentioned this, but also look to the formal social protection that's in place, even if it is low scale. But there is something to learn from that. That's the government capacity that is there, and that could be used. I'm not saying that necessarily it needs to be used, but it could be used. It depends on the case, and it's better to go to the field to find out if it can be used or not. The second point, the second approach, let's look at how social protection can enable the humanitarian response. So what I'm saying here in the case of Yemen illustrates that. So now they are going to use the database, this registry from the Social Welfare Fund, to also use it for the humanitarian response. I'm not going to say that it needs to be always like that. Sometimes the beneficiaries can be different, so it needs to be clear. We may not want to use this database that, of course, is the poorest in the country. We may need to do some geographical targeting instead of using this type of approach. And the second thing I would like to mention is try to reflect on how the humanitarian response, which I'm not very familiar with, could help to build the social protection. And I think that in the discussions, at least the ones we have had so far, it was a little bit of some sort of negative views, in the sense that not necessarily what the humanitarian assistance does is what social protection should be or could be in a sustainable way. I think that's important to have this concern in mind, but I think it's also important not to try to be so efficient and so exigent with the humanitarian assistance and with this, what social protection should be. I think that some thought should be given on that, especially in terms of the financing, because most of these countries, especially it is a really fragile context, it means they are going to receive budget support for decades. It's not for the income for 5 years, but they are going to receive for decades in order to stabilize. And if they're going to receive budget support, it's basically to build or reconstruct the state functions. And social protection is one of the activities, one of the key state functions, and should be seen like that. Then it should be in the budget. And therefore is going to receive support from the international community, from the donors anyway. So what one needs to make sure is that the experience that's learned through this humanitarian response can inform and can help to rebuild this part of the government functions and roles. So I think with that I covered these two sides and the two questions that have been asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I remember being in Sana and hearing very different stories than you see from the field, and I think that's a very important finding. Camilla?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to come last, and that's quite a few interventions there. Very helpful. I think one of the key points that's been made is around learning, and I just want to flesh out the learning that I think we've heard needs to happen over the course of the next few months and going forward. One example is, as Fabio said, is around really the need to build on existing social protection systems. So if you're in a humanitarian context, it's really looking what is there already, however fragile it is. And I was actually going to give the same example of Yemen, as Oxfam worked there and delivered cash using the social welfare fund that Yemen had in place, fragile as it was, but delivering cash through the postal service and using the lists and updating the lists that the social welfare fund had in place. So, you know, that's a really good example of a fragile context, a protracted crisis, and we were able to work at scale, so 300,000 people receive cash. Equally, I think, in the same way that we need to be mindful, and I'm talking here from a humanitarian perspective, it's a bit of a giveaway in my title, we need to be mindful of what is already there, what development activities are already in place, what government structures and systems are in place. We often do not, and we need to make a concerted effort to ensure that we do. And it might require employing different skills, having different types of people doing that work. Equally, as Fabio and others have said, I think there's a lot to learn from humanitarian experience and humanitarian response, and I think the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya is an example, the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, and now in Somalia, where they're developing their own national social protection policy and an implementation plan to go under, where there has been humanitarian crisis and humanitarian response continuously up until now with various degrees. So I think those are two sort of key learnings from each sector. And again, it speaks to this that keeps coming up, but I'm not sure it's quite been fleshed out, which is about the humanitarians and longer-term development practitioners actually working together, respecting what each one has to provide to the sector, to ensuring that we not only save lives immediately, but in the longer term, and protect people. And it's actually quite basic, but it is also quite fundamental. My sense is that sometimes we speak different languages, and that there is a cultural mindset that needs to change. And I think this conference actually is a really good first step in that direction. And I think things like the UN and World Bank Humanitarian Development Peace Initiative is another, and there's a lot more going on at global level. Now, I know this was also sort of picked up as well, it's not all about money, but I think financing is pretty critical. And I think we are talking about protracted crises, and there's a statistic that sticks to my mind that came up this morning, which is that 80% of protracted crises are protracted for more than 5 years. Now, humanitarian tools are not developed for 5-year responses. The financing, the funding cycles, this is the reality that we're in. We're talking, most of the crises that we're working are protracted, and what we need is long-term financing models and development actors there at the table working with humanitarians to deliver on the ground. And I think social protection is with all the talk of resilience and so many different types of initiatives, I am really excited that in social protection we've got something really quite tangible to develop, whether it is already within a crisis or pre-crisis, which is what is ideal. But as the colleague from UNICEF in Burundi pointed out, we're actually most of the time in crisis, and therefore we should be thinking about how we develop these in crises. I think the other learning is around really ensuring that our social protection systems have a good understanding of risk and vulnerability, so that they can remain agile and shift into gear when crisis hits. So understand that they may have a cohort of people that they assist in the long term, but are able to shift to include more people as a crisis hits, drought or other. Or it could be a heightened conflict in an area. I'm thinking of places like South Sudan and so on. So again, I think getting the targeting right, getting the people that need to benefit from the social protection system right is going to be essential. And I think we'll probably need to move beyond and go beyond proxy means testing. I think we're talking about really ensuring something much more community sensitive, and I think international, national, local organizations have a key role to play in defining the criteria and ensuring we have robust targeting systems and we're meeting the needs of those who need it the most. I think finally, really, it's about a couple of ideas, I guess. One is really ensuring that we all respect the different added value that we have as organizations. I think that, for example, as NGOs, and again, I'm talking local, national, as well as international NGOs, are in a good position to pilot, to experiment at small scale, working with local government, and then see ways of that these can be scaling up. It's all about working together to ensure the sustainability, working that you're not undermining what's going on with the government or what others are doing. So really working in that coordinated way. And again, that came out throughout the sessions today. That coordination is critical. And that plea we had from the Somali government just saying, please, respect, we have this policy, work towards it, don't undermine it, work within it. And for me, really resonated. And the final one, I'm just going to, and I'll leave it at that, is just this idea really around the financing of whether it would be possible to have a global pooled fund for social protection, a long-term fund that could solve some of the critical funding needs that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the panelists and for some very important insights. In fact, I've only received one question, so there's lots of scope for asking questions. And that question was around what you just mentioned, Camilla. Is there a need? This was said in terms of the, like, some governments are coping with large influx of refugees. So while they have well-established social protection systems, but for understandable reasons, they are not prepared to open these up to refugees. So does it make sense in this context to think of a supranational financing facility? Like, coming from a financial institution, we always like more finance. But is this something that we should even be dreaming about, or what's your view on this? It's clear that talking to governments, I used to be based in Palestine, and it's clear there that you've got 5 million Palestinian refugees living around the Middle East who are not considered part by their host governments for all sorts of political, historical reasons. But anyway, what's the role of supranational financing? Also, there's a specific question on what can we learn from multi-year financing in the Sahel to inform how we bridge the gap between humanitarian and social protection. I don't know if any of our panelists are familiar with that specific one? No? Anyway, so let me ask the question. What's the role of sort of supranational financing? What's the role of multi-year programs? And then I want to push you a little on this role of communities. Some of you mentioned the importance to understand the community coping mechanisms. Some of you mentioned they need to look at community targeting. So what's the role of community involvement in going forward? I should tell you my bias. I've spent many years working on community mobilization, and you can get some results, but some are not so great either. So, and any other things you want to add? So now's your chance. Do you want to start again?
Sure. Thank you so much, also to the fellow panelists for very interesting insights. Again, very yes or no questions, which are very difficult to answer. Like, somebody told me we need a paper of 20 pages to respond. But on the financing, I think that one thing that we may need to think differently, instead of thinking of we need a system for refugees, IDPs, host communities, at the end of the day, in many of these contexts, they're working and interacting in a same geographical focus. Now, can we think of a mechanism that can support them as a group, helping the integration, helping the joint contribution to their livelihoods and to the place that they're interacting. I think that we've been discussing this, I think, with many partners for a while. In many of the contexts that we work in, we still have limited expansion and limited coverage of social protection, even for the own citizens of a country, particularly those that are living in the agriculture sector. Those are dependent of natural resources, are not part of the formal social security system because they're not formalized sectors. And there's a big gap, I think was the latest ILO report that says those that are actually with less coverage are in the agriculture and rural sector in many of the countries. So to then, in that context, ask a government to then expand to non-citizens is definitely asking for a tough question for them to adopt. And even though we may think, and I think that it's the government responsibility to be able to fund and make this program sustainable, we are in a very complex situation where the idea of having different pooling or financing mechanisms that can finance those added parts of a system that make it shock responsive, which is what the point I was trying to make at the beginning. That there's definitely a role for development actors, for governments to invest resources, invest budget lines, and be able to have a system that is robust, that is at scale. But there's also elements that a global trust fund, which I think we try to push from the different angles, can contribute in helping those governments to build the systems, to build the nuts and bolts that are expensive, the registry systems, the shock responsive registry systems, the identification databases that are beyond just social and economic indicators, but it can also include, for example, environmental or conflict-related variables. Or how do we link early warning system with an MIS-type intervention, which is a costly intervention that includes analytical work as well as very operational. So it's not that we're going to create a supranational fund to replace, the national commitments and the commitments that need to happen at national level, but definitely to help governments to move from programs to systems, from safety nets to social protection systems, from scattered programs to something that is much more sustainable and really shock responsive. In terms of community, I think particularly in the context that I feel more familiar working with, which is Latin America and Africa, the community have played very different roles at design and implementation, as well as in terms of evaluation and accountability. In terms of design, trying to bring really the needs and the specific vulnerabilities that communities that we're trying to serve have, and being a voice in the design of the best intervention in terms of the size of the cash, in terms of the potential cash plus, in terms of the kinds of design specificities that we need to take into account in the design of these programs. In terms of implementation, to also help in the identification of who are the most vulnerable, who are the ones that are not receiving the benefits or the entitlements that that have the right to, in terms of helping to mobilize also local, if you want, collective action to be able to respond better to these interventions. And then in terms of accountability, making sure that what the national system promised to provide is actually happening, and to have some checks and balances and a formal accountability mechanism to have a much more, if you want, transparent and also efficient way of intervention. It's not, there's definitely some, if you want, checks and balances that need to happen, because there's power imbalances, particularly when we're talking of context of fragility, that I think in the morning somebody made it very, very clear, that it's not that the community also may have some issues around excluding some of the minority groups, for example, and how do we deal with that particular situation. But they do have, of course, and play a critical role across, I think, the project cycle, particularly in building systems.
Thank you, Carol. Before you have a go at answering whichever question you want, I've got a couple more. How do we take into account HIV needs, for instance, treatments? And I think I would make it broader. I mean, there are several vulnerable groups who have specific needs in context. in thinking through social protection programs. And again, the question came back, sort of the inverse of what was before. What are the incentives for national governments to include displaced people? And then the question that seems to say that we've all agreed that cash is the way forward when the context is right. So the question is then, when is the context right? So those are 3 additional questions. You can answer whichever one you want, or none of them. Carol.
I will take a stab at answering a couple, and maybe it will be somewhat disjointed. But I wanted to start out by just sort of talking a little bit about what I meant with the coping mechanisms and the sort of need to really look at triggering a response, if it is a short-term response, in a proactive way. And one way of doing that would be before, or if one understands well what types of negative coping strategies or mechanisms households or individuals or communities would need to refer to, and to be able to act before they get to that point, because obviously once they've gotten to that point, and one could say that we're reacting too late. I think of just very practically, there are experiences, there certainly are coping strategies that are important, and everybody has to engage in coping. So it's not to say that, you know, as soon as that happens, then people need to respond. But if we're talking about an immediate response, one would hope that we would be able to do that if we had an understanding of when, you know, the needs become very urgent. I would also say that this doesn't mean necessarily that it should be, maybe I can say cash or non-cash. It should be really specific to what the requirement and what the need is. So getting at that, when is cash appropriate, I think it really depends. It depends on what the outcome is and what resources you have available. Coming from USAID, we try to look at utilizing both cash as well as in kind. So sometimes there are just constraints as an implementer as to what types of resources you have and what you can utilize. I think the bottom line is being able to look at the context and going back to the age-old, what we continuously say, whether it's for development or for emergency, it would be do no harm. So if you're really in a position where in-kind resources are what you have, is that design of your program feasible, appropriate, or not? And that should really determine how those resources are used in the short term. In the longer term, I think, also dependent on the context, it's important to really have a good understanding of the long-term possibilities, the long-term vision of the government, of the host government, and of the community to really help decide what types of resources in the short term you're proposing to use, because I definitely feel that those types of decisions have to be made in concert with other partners in the field and government partners, as well as non-government partners that you would be working with, that one would be working with. As I said, very disjointed.
No, thank you. Fabio, which question do you want to answer?
Just quickly, a couple of comments on the
community coping mechanism or understanding informal social protection mechanisms at the community level. Just to emphasize that I'm not saying that it's always good, so it may be good, it may be bad. Some of the coping mechanisms, even at the community level, can be very bad, but some of them can help us try to understand or try to be innovative in terms of the social protection mechanism that the formal sector, the formal social protection may offer in the future. In particular, I think here on how communities pool funds together, and at the same time, in terms of the formal social protection, especially in some low-income countries, it's so hard to make them to believe any form of contributory social protection or making them contributory to insurance, understand what is the limit, especially as insurance is coming out as one of the recommendations that we should be looking at, try to understand why people don't invest it. And on the other side, also highlighting that coverage shocks actually is a major impediment and a major shock for the community coping mechanisms as well, because then they won't be in a position to help each other. And finally, just something that Natalia also said is actually the community can be an exclusionary factor for some of the potential beneficiaries. So it's something that we need to pay attention. That's also something that in the case of Yemen was one of the things that were flagged, especially by UNICEF on this possibility with one of the minority groups.
Camilla?
Okay, so I'll attempt to answer one of the other questions. Maybe I'll start with the cash. Is it the way forward when the context is right? I mean, I was quite surprised to what extent cash is just seen as the thing, actually. And however, I think throughout the course of the day, when talking about social protection, that is, I think it's been clear that it isn't just cash on its own will not answer all needs and will not address all the needs. And there's a need to have much more of a comprehensive approach, ensure access to basic services, water, health, etc. And I think that came out in a number of the presentations. And I think it was Chris on the Somalia panel who talked about how actually malnutrition levels stayed quite high. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong. Where's Chris? Is he there? And cash was not able to address the malnutrition levels to the extent that's expected. And that was despite, so okay, you need functioning markets, etc. But I think we really need to come back to that message, and it's come out in a number of the presentation. It's not a panacea. You need other basic services in order for it to fulfill its potential as well. And of course, markets functioning and so on. We know the debates, and Oxfam's been very vocal about it as well. I think more interesting is that question around what are the incentives for government to include displaced people. I think that's a really interesting question and a challenging one. I think I was thinking back at the time of in Jordan, a piece of work that we tried to do was trying to look at what skills the Syrian refugees brought to Jordan that were attractive to people. So what kind of livelihood opportunities could those skills bring that would mean that it would benefit the economy of Jordan? And that's a piece of work that we looked at. So making the business case, showing how displaced people can contribute to the economy is not made enough. And obviously we're not talking necessarily immediately as they're in desperate need, but as they stay and so on, I think there's a lot to say around what displaced people, refugees bring to a community and to a country and a population. And the second thought that came to mind was the case of Uganda, which has had this amazing policy towards South Sudan refugees. And we had I can't see her now, but a great presentation of their social protection program. But just thinking specifically at how the Office of the President is leading that response, it's led at a very high level. And I think Uganda is benefiting from it. I think as a result, financially, Uganda is also, as a country, benefiting from it. So there's something there around also being able to support and get support to support, which could benefit not only the displaced and refugees, but also the host communities and the country in itself. It's a thought, but it's a good question.
Thank you very much to the panel. So let me tell you what I heard, and then we will continue tomorrow to try and refine these messages as we go forward. I heard some clear message for those of us on the social protection side, I count myself on that, is that as we build systems, and I think it's important, I just came back to social protection after being away for more than a decade. And to see that so many of the poorest countries in the world have invested their own resources in building systems. We're in a completely different world than we were 10 years ago. I mean, just out of concessional financing from the World Bank, it's several $billions a year that governments are borrowing for and investing in these systems. This is an amazing change. So there's something there to build on. But as we as practitioners go in and build and help countries build those systems, we need to make them flexible. We need to think about good targeting. Yes, I mean, the bank will always talk about that. We want the government to spend its money as effectively as possible. But sometimes that targeting needs to be, you know, dare I say it, based on other things than income and well-being. Maybe it's based on where you live. Are you affected by that drought this year? And that's one thing that it was mentioned, but I also think that we are, in the social protection community, we're not good at looking at early warning systems. I mean, I get so impressed with satellite imagery, for instance. We can target a village and see that there is not in that their crops aren't growing long before we get the data back from some household survey. So we could immediately, if we had a system in place, up the payment for that village so that they would move forward, irrespective of their poverty status. So I think the early warning systems, and I think for the humanitarian systems, it's be realistic. Try to work with whatever is there. I think that's a very key message. With all its warts, many of these systems are just being set up, are just running. But see what's there, see what you can work on. Again, living in Palestine, seeing the sort of smooth transition between the targeted system that the government is financing together with the European Union and the World Bank, and what World Food Programme and other in the humanitarian space are doing, the European Commission on the humanitarian side. It can be done. It can be a smooth transition. It just takes a little bit of will and talking to each other. And then it's very important that we do some joint learning as we are both implementing. As the humanitarian system is being implemented, what are we learning? What are the right targeting mechanisms? How can we use technology, etc.? I think a very important point that was made in one of the parallel sessions, don't miss opportunities. Let's not sit around and wait until the perfect case study moves. And I think the Yemen research that was done is a very good example. That wasn't something that was planned. That came in, was done as part of doing something. So like someone once said, we need to fix the plane while still flying, right? So we need to keep learning from that. And I think there's a whole role for contingency financing. There are actually some of the Caribbean islands did benefit from a catastrophic bond that was issued. So it is possible to do. But I think what we're missing in the insurance is, as long as it's local, you need to increase the insurance pool to make it global. And maybe that's the role for some global money or some global guarantees that could help make sure that, I mean, fortunately, we still don't have too many covariate shocks where it happens in several places at the same time. With climate change, it will become more covariant. But we still have a chance to do that. So I think there is something to do there. And then finally, I think there was a very important point made, is that we need to respect each other and work together. And if I can just point to World Food Programme and the World Bank, we've tried to set something we call an engine room up, sort of very practically, just to learn together, how do we do the handover? I mean, and we've taken a couple of country studies and really gone into it. And this learning has been very useful. We're seeing how we could work much better together. And it really, again, doing it very practically, respect each other. Look at the comparative advantage of each actors. So let me end by the plea is to be ambitious. I think Natalia said that. Be ambitious. Obviously be realistic, but don't be so realistic that you don't dare be ambitious. And finally, be strategically opportunistic. Have a clear strategy of grabbing the opportunities when it's there and moving forward. Because like living in the United States, one of the most famous people there that I've learned a lot from reading his works was Martin Luther King. And he wrote a famous letter when he was in jail in, I think it was in Montgomery, he was in jail. And he wrote a letter, and basically the message is, and he said it much more eloquently than I can, that I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to sit around and wait till everything happens. We need to be out there. And that's our challenge, whether we're humanitarians or social protection professionals. Let's not wait. Thank you.